Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable. My name is Adam Bentz, and I'm the Assistant Director of Library and Archives at the York County History Center. We are very proud to have hosted a number of these programs over the last year via Zoom, and we're happy to have a great relationship with the York Civil War Roundtable. This relationship dates back for well over 10 years, and with the participation of Kathy Frio, Program Director, Scott Menges and Scott Rosenau, Assistant Program Directors, they've been able to put together a great list of speakers over the last year, especially on Zoom, which has been quite a feat, but also for many, many years. And it's made our roundtable something that's much more than a county destination, but something that's attracted people from the region. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our typical upcoming event promotions for the History Center. Obviously tonight, I hope everybody's here to listen to Professor Allardice, who will be talking about baseball in the Civil War. And he'll be beginning in just a few minutes. But coming up in the following, I should not say the following Tuesday, but next Tuesday, May 25th at 11 a.m., we'll be welcoming Christine Cooper, the Manager of Public Programs for the History Center, and she'll be continuing in her long string of 18th century cooking demonstrations. So on Tuesday, the 25th, she'll be demonstrating cooking duck with green peas, which sounds pretty interesting. Duck's not an easy thing to prepare, from what I understand. This will be an in-person event at the Colonial Complex in the garden area. However, she also plans to share clips via Facebook Live, as far as I know at this time. On May 26th, a week from tonight at 7:00 p.m., the History Center will be welcoming back the All Vets organization, which had an event last month and will be again having an in-person and Zoom event. This time, All Vets will be welcoming Brenda Webb, an Army Field Communications veteran who will be talking about her experiences. After that, on Thursday, June 3rd at 7 p.m., we will be welcoming the Writers' Roundtable into the library and archives at the main Historical Center building. This will be an in-person and Zoom event, and Delma Rivera Lytle, who many of you are probably familiar with, will be talking about her work in writing on the Latino history of the Latino community in the York area. On June 13th, that's Sunday, June 13th at 2:30 p.m., the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be hosting its monthly meeting, and this will be an in-person and Zoom event. And the topic will be sort of a historical retrospective on the history of the Henry James Young Award, which is something that's been presented to many people over the years. So please stay tuned and consider participating, either attending in person or registering and attending on Zoom. And what many people may be curious about, what will we be doing in the Civil War Roundtable next month? Well, obviously things have been changing regarding the pandemic, and after a lot of deep thought and consideration, the York Civil War Roundtable plans to return to in-person next month on the 16th, the third Wednesday, as it usually is. That date seems a little early to me, but I double-checked the calendar, and the 16th is the third Wednesday. So at 7 p.m., the roundtable will be returning to the Historical Society, but it will be on Zoom. As we're doing all of our live programs, in-person programs, we're going to have it on Zoom as well. We've been attracting many people from the region and from out of state, which is something we certainly want to encourage. And of course, if you want to err on the side of caution, I strongly encourage that these days. So we will be continuing on Zoom as well. The topic will be the Old Keystone State Speaks Today, Gettysburg's Pennsylvania Veterans Reunion of 1889, presented by Cody Eash of the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg. I'll just read this description, which I think sounds like something that's right up our alley in the roundtable. Of the 90,000 soldiers who served under the United States flag at the Battle of Gettysburg, nearly 1/3 were Pennsylvanians. And I'll be honest, until I read this, I did not know the number was quite that high. 1/3 is an amazing contribution. 26 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, on September 11th and 12th, 1889, many of those veterans returned to Adams County for Pennsylvania Day, a 48-hour festival which commemorated the wartime service of the men from the Keystone State. Tens of thousands of visitors gathered to witness this spectacle, to dedicate most of the Pennsylvania monuments upon the Gettysburg battlefield, and to deliver and listen to speeches about combat, death, union, treason, slavery, and emancipation. It's pretty heavy stuff. Join Cody Eash for a discussion about what those who were present said and did during their return to Gettysburg, when their words and actions illustrated their collective memory of participating in the Civil War's bloodiest battle upon the soil of the state they called home. So I invite you to join us next month for this interesting presentation. All right. So tonight I have the privilege of introducing our speaker, Bruce S. Allardice, who serves as professor of history at South Suburban College. Professor Allardice is past president of the Northern Illinois Civil War Roundtable and past president of the Civil War Roundtable of Chicago. He has authored or co-authored 6 books and numerous articles on the Civil War. His latest book is 2 Years Before the Paddle Wheel, Charles F. Gunther, Mississippi River Confederate, the edited diary of a German-born steamboat officer who later became Chicago's leading candy maker. In addition to his significant contributions to Civil War history, Professor Allardice currently heads up the Civil War Baseball Subcommittee for the Society of American Baseball Research, SABR, and is a member of SABR's Biography Committee, specializing in researching the lives of 19th century ball players. His article on the rise of baseball in the South received an award from the Society of American Baseball Research for Best Baseball History Article of 2012. His groundbreaking work on the early spread of baseball, done at the request of Major League Baseball, can be found at www.protoball.org, the pre-pro baseball link. He's also co-authored 2 articles on Civil War baseball published in the journal Baseball. He is currently editor of the SABR Origins of Baseball newsletter. And before we begin tonight, just please remember, we ask you to save your questions for the end. However, if you'd like to type anything into the chat function, I will be monitoring it through the night, but we'll try to address all of your questions. Without further ado, Professor Allardice.
Thank you, Adam. I'll unmute myself here and let's do a little share screen. Just a second here. Come on. There we go. Well, appreciate being here tonight. Sort of give you a teaser topic here. Who the heck is Abner Doubleday and why did he invent baseball? That's sort of my way of segueing into baseball in the Civil War era. Now, I often get asked, how do you, a baseball historian, how did you get involved in baseball, a Civil War historian, how did you get involved in baseball history in the first place? Well, turns out a fellow teacher of mine was a member of the Society of American Baseball Research, and he invited me to come to one of the SABR national conventions in Atlanta, as it turned out, and they had a seminar, a very well attended one, by the way, on the origins of baseball and baseball before 1871, before it became professional baseball. And they started to talk about how baseball spread after the Civil War. And they were talking about, well, why did they go to Knoxville, Tennessee? Or why did they station in Salisbury, North Carolina? Why did baseball start there or not somewhere else? And the speaker said, is anybody in the audience a Civil War historian? And like a dummy, I raised my hand and said, yeah, I'm a Civil War historian. I can tell you why. It's because they had a prisoner of war camp and they played baseball in Salisbury during the war. and I got sucked into it ever since. And now I'm editing a baseball origins newsletter, as well as writing on. I'm probably spending as much time writing on this baseball during this period as I am on the Civil War itself. Well, tonight what I'm going to be talking about is not your usual Civil War topic. I won't be talking about any battles. Not going to be talking about any strategy or tactics. No cannon, no guns, no generals. Instead, I'm going to be talking about a sport that was just starting to become the national pastime around 1861. And a sport on which the soldiers in both armies probably spent more time playing baseball than they did fighting battles. And that sport is, of course, baseball. Now, baseball is considered America's national pastime. It's been so ever since, from my statistical study, 1858. And baseball has always served to unify Americans. So it's sort of appropriate that we talk about baseball during the Civil War period, because the Civil War was the greatest rent in the fabric of American society. In times of war, in times of natural disaster, World War I, World War II, the game has always provided an emotional escape for people of all ages, races, genders, and everything else. They can collectively find solace at the ballpark. Therefore, I think it's fitting that we talk about baseball during this Civil War era, because as much as they differed about politics and about abolition and things like that, the one thing that both sides were unified on was baseball. Well, first, a little question. I'm a teacher, I like to quiz my classes. What do Albert Einstein, Angelina Jolie, and Abraham Lincoln have in common? Probably a lot of things. None of them invented baseball. But neither did this guy, General Abner Doubleday. I mean, those of you who are familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg, of course, know Doubleday's great contributions with the First Corps and everything. There was a legend that grew up that Abner Doubleday, the future general, invented baseball. Modern scholarship has diminished that idea, but it was well-intentioned how this myth came about. In 1908, Major League Baseball appointed a blue ribbon committee to try and determine when baseball started in this country. And they got a letter from this guy in Colorado named Abner Graves, and he said, I know exactly what it was. 1839, Cooperstown, New York. Abner Doubleday took time off from being a student at West Point. He was an engineer, so he laid out the diamond. I can give you, here's the names of the players and everything. And the letter was so impressive and in such detail that this Blue Ribbon Commission said, yeah, okay, baseball started 1839, Cooperstown, New York. Sounds perfect to me. It's the right time, right area in that. And they went ahead and sanctioned a Baseball Hall of Fame to be located in Cooperstown, New York. Well, what they found out a couple years later was that Abner Graves was a BS artist. And maybe a little Alzheimer-y too. It turned out that the Abner Doubleday he remembered was not the general, but his cousin of the same name. That the General Abner Doubleday never set foot in Cooperstown, New York in 1839. And that Abner Doubleday, who left voluminous papers and writings, never once mentioned baseball, let alone mention inventing baseball. It's odd that his military service has been largely forgotten today, but his completely bogus connection to baseball has given him what fame today he actually has. When we're talking about baseball, we're talking about a game that evolved. No one person or no one organization invented baseball. In fact, bat ball games had been played for at least 800 years before that. What you see here is a picture from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which is an illustrated Spanish songbook from the year 1280. And the song is about some young Spanish people playing a bat ball game. And you take a look at that, and it looks very much like baseball. Bat ball games of some sort or other had been around for hundreds of years before Major League Baseball and before 1845. More probably, the Knickerbocker Club of New York invented not a bat ball game, but the more or less modern rules that we play under today. And even that's in dispute. I'm trying here to give you an idea of what baseball was like during the Civil War and what kind of baseball they played. Now, the early teams there were no pro teams. There was no professional baseball. There were no professional team sports either, for that matter. That doesn't come until far later. What they were social clubs. These are young middle-class New Yorkers looking for a bit of exercise and, probably have a few beers after the game or something like that. A baseball club back then was not only amateurs, but it was more akin to a Masonic Temple Club or the Rotary Club or something like that. The idea that you'd have professionals being paid to play a game was just beyond the imagination. This is a picture of it. You might have seen a vintage baseball game, quote unquote. There are a number of teams across the nation that play baseball according to the 1858 rules. In fact, there's a vintage baseball national association. This is a picture of one of these modern teams. Notice what he doesn't have: a glove. Baseball then was more like modern softball. The pitching was underhand. Nobody had a glove. And the idea of pitching was not to get the batter out. Rather, it was just to toss the ball into the air so that the batter could strike the ball. It was a fielding and batting game, not a pitching game. And as we'll see, the scores could be softball team scores, very high. During the 1860s, there were in fact two different baseball games: the Massachusetts rules baseball game and the New York rules baseball game. This is a map of the Massachusetts game. You can't call it a diamond, it was a square, really. And the batter or striker was in the middle of one of the four sides of the square, rather than on one of the corners. The biggest difference between the two games was under the Massachusetts rules, and this was adopting old town ball rules and other bat ball game rules. You could get a runner out by soaking him. And soaking was basically when the runner's running around the bases, if you hit him with the baseball, he's out. I think you can guess why the Massachusetts rules game was supplanted by the New York rules game. First of all, too many base runners were getting concussions from getting hit on the head with a hard ball. The second reason is they had to soften up the ball to keep the players from getting injured, and the ball got so soft you couldn't hit it anywhere far. Whereas under the New York rules, they didn't have soaking, so you could have a much harder ball, it would go much further, and would produce a much more exciting game. Now here's other differences between the 1858 rules and today. I should emphasize that these rules changed from year to year, and that not all amateur teams adopted the rules that were agreed upon by the Association of Amateur Baseball Teams. For a number of years, If you caught something on the first bounce, that was like catching it on a fly. There were no leadoffs. There were no foul lines. The first, second, and third baseman had to be touching their respective bags with their feet when the pitch was thrown. Games would start to go on forever because the batter would refuse to swing at pitches, so they gave the umpire the discretion to call strikes in 1858. They didn't have to. There was no strike zone, but the umpire could, if they want to, call strikes to hurry up the game. And then when pitchers deliberately tried to wear out the batter by throwing 20 wild pitches, they gave the umpire discretion to call balls also. That's where our modern ball and strike rules come from. This is a picture of the Knickerbocker Club, a famous New York club, playing at their home field on Elysian Fields in New Jersey. Notice there's no stands. There was not an enclosed ballpark in the nation until 1862, and very few before 1870. So no enclosed ballpark, you essentially couldn't charge admission. You couldn't sell tickets. And this is a picture of how they would have played games when they were in the Army. You see an open field there. I've seen games, you hit the ball into the trees out there. Well, it's still in play. I mean, if the ball gets stuck in the trees, the runner can just keep running around until somebody shakes it off the tree. It was all, you can see the fans on one side here and the umpire there. By the way, the umpire did not make most of the calls. That's a modern invention. If there was a close play at first base, both teams would first off be called upon to agree whether the runner was safe or out, and only if the teams disagreed would the umpire come in to render a decision. By 1861, the game had struck the national fancy. It was a big part of the popular culture. Now here is one of the probably very famous songs of 1861, the Home Run Quick Step, written in honor of the Mercantile Baseball Club of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Franklin Mint has collector plates in these days. Well, here's a baseball plate from 1860, decorated with the batter and the catcher. Even political cartoons riffed off baseball's popularity. Here's an 1860 election cartoon, Abraham Lincoln on the right there and his three opponents on the left. On the guy on the left, John Bell's laments that he had 3 strikes and is out. Again, the baseball slang reference was thought to be understood by all the readers of this newspaper. Meanwhile, Lincoln on the right proclaims, "Gentlemen, if any of you should ever take a hand in another match of this game, remember you must have a good bat and strike a fair ball to make a home run." Where was baseball played in 1861? Well, the New York game really started in the greater New York City area, but it spread throughout the nation, especially where New Yorkers had moved to. Practically every big city in the nation had baseball at this time. New York, Brooklyn, Chicago, San Francisco, many, many more. And to be more South Central Pennsylvania specific, the first baseball in Harrisburg, 1860, Carlisle in 1861, York and Gettysburg had baseball teams in 1865, and Lancaster, Columbia, Hanover, New Oxford, and Chambersburg in 1866. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania had 26 pre-war baseball clubs. Baltimore had 9 pre-war clubs. Harrisburg, prior to 1871, I found 29 different baseball teams in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania alone. York, Pennsylvania had several teams, including the Nationals and the Seneca. They played on the York Common, right by the old Army Hospital there, on those grounds there. And Scott Mingus, I think you'll be interested to know that a Spangler, yeah, cousin of one of the Spanglers of Spangler's Farm fame, he was the third baseman for one of these teams. The club president of the Nationals, Leander Myers, he was a private in one of those 1862 emergency companies raised to defend Pennsylvania against Lee's Antietam invasion. These baseball teams in York and Gettysburg were sprinkled with Civil War veterans. There's a very direct connection between baseball and the Civil War veterans of South Central Pennsylvania. Baseball was already played in the Confederacy also. Again, this is something that I got an award for my article discovering this. Now, Baltimore, Louisville, St. Louis, they're sort of border states, DC. But there were 22 baseball teams in New Orleans before the war. There was more baseball teams in New Orleans than there was in Chicago. We had teams in Galveston and Houston, Texas, Macon and Augusta, Georgia, Norfolk, Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia. And in fact, there were a lot of famous Confederates who were pre-war baseball players. On my left, and hopefully your left too, is Basil Duke, General Basil Duke, John Hunt Morgan's second in command. He was the top pitcher on the St. Louis, Missouri's top amateur baseball team before the war. The commander of the submarine Hunley before George Dixon, Lieutenant John A. Payne in the center there. He was, after the war, the president of the Alabama Baseball Association. On the right is Lightning Ellsworth, Morgan's famous telegrapher. Well, he was a member of the Houston, Texas team before the war. Abraham Lincoln had strong baseball links. There's strong evidence that he played baseball. One story, in fact, says that when the Republican Party nominated him for president in 1860, the telegram was sent to Springfield to notify him of this, and he received it when he was at bat during a baseball game in Springfield. During the war, many games were played on the White House lawn, which Lincoln occasionally took time off to watch. And when President Lincoln went to the old soldiers' home for relaxation, which he did quite often, there usually was a sandlot game with the local boys, and he quite often joined in the boys with the game. In fact, one of the boys left a reminiscence saying, Lincoln enjoyed nothing more than playing baseball with the boys. And in fact, his long legs, they had a hard time hitting him with the baseball when he was running the bases. They were trying to soak him. Well, the war starts, and thousands of members of Northern baseball clubs volunteered for service in the Union Army. And just about all the members of the Southern baseball clubs volunteered for the Confederate Army. Sort of understandable. The baseball players were generally, young, healthy young men, 18 to 28 years old. I mean, that's prime wartime service material there. And they took their baseballs with them. A.G. Mills of Cincinnati, who later on was president of the National League, packed a bat and ball with them and brought them with him to the Army. 91 members of perhaps the best amateur baseball team in 1860, the Brooklyn Excelsiors, 91 of them volunteered for the Union Army. Now, I've done statistical studies, again, sort of the first ever statistical studies on Civil War soldier baseball. I have found 400 references to soldiers playing baseball. 87% of the references are Union, 13% Confederate. 52% of the ball playing accounts come from soldiers just from the 3 northeastern states, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, even though they only accounted for 24% of Union soldiers. And again, if you realize that the game was actually called the New York game and had its origins in New York, and most of the early baseball players and teams were centered in New York, that might be understandable. The Union Army of the Potomac led with baseball playing mentions, but every army had baseball being played there, and baseball was played by soldiers in every state in the nation. The games that we know of were usually played in camp, and usually or disproportionately in the spring. Again, that makes sense. They were waiting for the roads to dry for their summer and fall campaigns. 1863, for example, before Chancellorsville, those 3 months before Chancellorsville are just filled with accounts of Union soldiers playing baseball near Fredericksburg and Falmouth, Virginia. Well, we hear about reconciliation of North and South. Well, sometimes not even baseball could achieve reconciliation. This is Alex Pearson. Now, before the war, he was the star first baseman for the Brooklyn Excelsiors baseball club. However, he was born in Alabama. He was a medical student studying medicine at Columbia at the time. And when the war starts, Brooklyn Excelsiors noticed that Pearson wasn't showing up for the games anymore. Well, in 1862, some Excelsior players got captured after being in the Army and were sent to a prison hospital near Richmond. And they found out that the doctor treating the Union prisoners was none other than their old teammate, Alex Pearson. The Brooklyn Excelsior club, when they heard about that, formally voted to expel Pearson from the team. As I said, we hear many stories about reconciliation between North and South after the war. For the most part, that's true, but there are exceptions. And one of them was this one instance in baseball. In 1866, the Union Baseball Club of Washington, D.C., as you can tell from the name, they were made up of government employees and former Union Army veterans. They wanted to go to Richmond to play some of the amateur baseball teams down there. And the Richmond Baseball Club wrote back and refused to play them with the words, quote, "The Richmond Baseball Club does not desire and will not play the Union Club a single game. Our reason? We are Southerners." Now, even the hometown Richmond newspapers criticized them for their sectionalism. And as it turns out, the Union team went down and played other Richmond teams, and that was fine. You know, there's no problem at all. There was reconciliation. This is just one of the few very famous examples where there wasn't. I want to emphasize there were no sporting goods stores in those days, no Walmarts or Dick's Sporting Goods or anything like that. And if you wanted baseball equipment, you had to make it yourself. And this is one example. This picture's this is a baseball at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. It was a baseball made by and carried into the Army by Private David Wheeler of the 27th Indiana. I want to emphasize, bats, well, you just got somebody who was skilled in carving, and you got a piece of wood and you carved a bat out. If you wanted a baseball, you got some yarn, you got some leather, maybe you had a shoemaker stitch it all together. There were no uniform sizes for the bats or the balls, no uniform hardness for these things. It's not really until after the Civil War that sporting goods companies come into life and start to make uniform baseball equipment. And the Amateur Baseball Association starts to adopt rules as to how big the baseball must be and how hard it must be. The war affected amateur teams north and south in many ways. In 1861, at the start of the war, an amateur team made up of members of the 71st New York Infantry, part of the Irish Brigade, defeated the Washington Nationals Amateur Club by 41-13. A year later, when the 71st Regiment was stationed again in the Washington defenses, their team went out to play the Washington Nationals, and this time the Nationals won 28-13. What had happened? Well, again, the 71st New York had lost some of their best players to battle, to illness, to disease, and to wounds. One of the biggest sporting events as far as attendance goes, perhaps the biggest one in America in the 19th century, occurred on Christmas Day of 1862 at Hilton Head, South Carolina. It was a baseball game between the 165th New York, again, a New York City regiment. They had a lot of pre-war ball players, and a team based on all the other units, drawn from all the other units and teams of the Union garrison there. According to one story, 40,000 people watched that game. The garrison, escaped slaves, the civilians, the Navy, everybody else. Records of Confederate baseball are much harder to come by, in part because Southern newspapers, didn't survive the war and everything. In part because Southerners even had a harder time than their Northern counterparts in getting good bats and balls. In historian Belle Irvin Wiley's words, quote, "The bat might be a board, a section of some farmer's rail fence. The pellet may be nothing more than a yarn-wrapped walnut, but enthusiasm would be so great as to make the camp reverberate with cheers when the players played with this equipment." The Charleston, South Carolina Mercury in 1862 remarked that, quote, "Every volunteer who has been in service has realized that the tedium of camp life might be relieved by baseball." The newspaper went on to lament the shortage of sporting goods for the men. For one of such items, the newspaper ominously included the time of the soldiers mainly spent playing cards and drinking whiskey. And we don't want that. Now, there have always been rumors of Union and Confederate soldiers playing baseball against each other during a lull in the battle. Well, nobody, including myself, has ever been able to verify such an account. However, after the surrender at Appomattox, and while the Confederate soldiers are waiting to get their paroles, it is a fact that the soldiers on both sides played baseball games while waiting the 2 days to get their paperwork processed. And maybe that's where the story comes from, who knows. Baseball did bring the sides together. Private John Adams of the 19th Massachusetts recalled that in early 1863, his regiment was encamped near Fredericksburg, Virginia. And while playing baseball themselves, they could look across the Rappahannock River and see the Confederates playing baseball on the other side of the river. He wrote, quote, "We would sit on the bank of the river and watch their games, and the distance was so short we could understand every movement and would applaud every good play." This is the only verified photo of Civil War soldiers playing baseball. This is at Fort Pulaski near Savannah, South Carolina. As you know, Fort Pulaski was captured by Union soldiers in 1862. And this is a photo of the 49th, a company of the 49th New York on 48th New York, on dress parade in the foreground. It was a Brooklyn unit with many pre-war baseball players. And you can see in the background other members of the 48th Pennsylvania playing baseball to pass the time. Now, I was at Fort Pulaski. Some of you might have been at Fort Pulaski. I've been to Fort Pulaski. And one of the things that struck me was when you're inside the fort, to me, it looks a lot like Wrigley Field in Chicago. You got brick walls about the same height. That's about the same size as the interior of Wrigley Field in Chicago. And frankly, some of it looked just as decrepit, and out of repair in some parts of Wrigley Field also. Well, this is a picture of a Soldiers baseball team. Many times soldiers would write home to the local newspapers or to their family talking about baseball. And that's much more pleasant to write about for them than talking about battles. In the spring of 1862, a baseball game between the 57th and 69th New York, well, Private Jacob Cole was lying on the ground watching the match when he heard a rumbling noise. When Cole and his friends stood up, they heard nothing, but when they put their ears to the ground, they could hear the rumbling. And Cole told our friends, "Our boys are fighting somewhere out there." He remembered, quote, "Hardly had I spoken before orders came to report to our regiments at once." So the game came to a sudden stop, never to resume. In November of 1863, in Virginia again, Private Charles Davis of the 13th Massachusetts reports that while his regiment was awaiting orders to attack a nearby Confederate force, we got tired of the inaction, so we had a game of baseball to pass the time away. Occasionally, the baseball would be batted over the crest of the hill in front of us and in the range of rebel skirmishers, necessitating someone going after it. It was a risky business and required quick work, but it was gotten back every time. Sometimes a baseball game would be interrupted by the call of battle. George Putnam, another Union soldier, humorously wrote of a game in Alexandria, Louisiana, that was called early due to a surprise attack on their camp by Confederate infantry. Said Putnam, quote, "Suddenly there was a scattering of fire, which 3 outfielders caught the brunt. The center fielder was hit and was captured. The left and right fielders managed to get back to our lines. The attack was repelled without serious difficulty, but we had lost not only our center fielder, but the only baseball in Alexandria, Louisiana." It was common for one regiment to play another, or a baseball team from one company within a regiment to play another. And the unit baseball rivalries often matched the well-known unit military rivalries. Private John Adams of the 19th Massachusetts recalled in 1863, his regiment challenged the 7th Michigan Infantry to a match game for $60 a side. Now remember, $60 is 5 months' pay for a private, so that's serious money. The Massachusetts team won, and rather than pocket the money, the Massachusetts players spent it on a grand banquet for both teams and their guests. Adams later declared, quote, "It was a grand time, and all agreed it was nicer to play baseball than rifle ball." On a slightly more elevated level, Captain Lemuel Abbott of the 10th Vermont and his fellow officers of the regiment played a match game with the non-commissioned officers of that regiment for an oyster dinner, which the officers won and ate. Well, sometimes generals got into the game as well. Private Davis of the 13th Massachusetts recalled a day in 1862 when his regiment was playing baseball. And the brigade commander, General George Hartsuff, pictured here, rode by, quote, "got off his horse and requested permission to catch behind the batter, informing us there was nothing he enjoyed so much." Although he stayed only a few minutes, Hartsuff impressed Davis, quote, "without in the least sacrificing his dignity or suggesting the lessening of his discipline, the cords of which we were already noticing were tightening." In January of 1864, Private Thomas Aldrich of the 1st Rhode Island Battery participated in a baseball game to honor General William Hayes. Well, it turned out that the general and his wife galloped by and saw the game, and the captain of the unit, the battery, came out to greet the general and said, "General, I suppose you would like to see our battery drill." And the general quickly replied, "No, I want to see them play ball, which they can do better than any men I ever saw." The health benefits to the soldier and to society as a whole, of sports in general, and baseball in particular, were well known during this period. The Boston Christian Advocate in 1861 noted that Army regulations encourage commanders to, quote, encourage useful occupation and manly exercises and diversions among the men, and to repress dissipation and immorality. After noting that the French and British armies encouraged sports, the Advocate opined that baseball and cricket would save any amount of grumbling by the bored soldiers. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was during the Civil War sort of the equivalent of the Red Cross or USO, did a survey of 200 Union Army regiments, and they reported that in 42 of the regiments, over 1/5 of the regiments, systematic athletic recreation such as football or baseball were general. In 156, there were none sponsored by the unit. And when there were none, card playing and other indoor games took their place, which invited, of course, drinking and gambling abuses. This is sort of famous in Chicago. This is the so-called Turchin tree bat. Well, Colonel and future General Basil Turchin commanded the 19th Illinois Infantry. And the 19th Illinois Infantry was part of the last stand on Snodgrass Ridge in the Battle of Chickamauga. And the 19th was so moved by their stand there that what they did was they took a tree a little later from that ridge, made it into a baseball bat, and sent it home to Chicago. And what they did was they announced that this would be a grand prize bat awarded to the team that won the Chicago City Championship amateur baseball team. And for several years, the leading amateur teams in Chicago competed for this bat as a prize. One of the revelations of my research has been how much baseball was played in Civil War POW camps. In fact, every POW camp that had enough space had some sort of baseball played there. Rock Island, Camp Butler in Illinois, Camp Chase in Ohio, Elmira, New York. Even outside Andersonville, they played baseball. This is a famous illustration of a baseball game being played by the prisoners at the Salisbury, North Carolina POW camp. Now, this is obviously an idealized setting. I mean, the prisoners are probably a lot better dressed and a lot healthier than they were in reality. And it looks like an idyllic field, doesn't it? According to one prisoner, they gave up on the Massachusetts game where you could hit players with a baseball to get them out because the players in their weakened conditions as prisoners of war, they couldn't resist bruises and bumps and everything. That could get them seriously ill. So they decided to play by the New York rules, which intrigued the guards. The game, according to Clarkson, the game of baseball had been played much in the South, but many of them, the guards, had never seen the sport played. Eventually, they found proper bats for us to play, and we fashioned a ball that was soft and a great bounder. By and large, according to the prisoner, baseball was a popular pastime of troops, both inside the prisoner of war camp and the guards, as a means of relaxing before and after the battle. Johnson's Island prisoner of war camp, just outside of Sandusky, Ohio. That was a prisoner of war camp for Confederate Army officers. The privates went to other camps. The officers were generally sent to Johnson's Island. In late 1863, at the Battle of Rappahannock Station, most of the Louisiana Brigade of Robert E. Lee's army was captured. And Louisiana officers were sent, of course, to Johnson's Island. Now, many of the younger officers had been members of the pre-war New Orleans baseball clubs. And these officer prisoners of war quickly organized prisoner baseball clubs there. In late 1864, the quote-unquote Confederate Club of prisoners challenged the quote-unquote Southern Club to a game. Now, the Confederate Club was composed of higher-ranking officers, while the Southern Club consisted of officers below the rank of captain. One witness, Lieutenant Michael McNamara of New Orleans, estimated that 3,000 Confederate prisoners watched this game. And 3,000 was as good a turnout as you could get in a crowd for any New York game among leading amateur teams at the time. The Southern Club won 19-13. Numerous wagers were placed on the outcome, and the rebel yell was frequently heard when one club or the other made an outstanding play. Lieutenant McNamara noticed the joy that the game brought to the prisoners, but the Union prisoners' authorities thought the Confederates were having too much fun, and the prison commander banned future baseball activity. Now, here's one difference between North and South. In the North, amateur baseball teams, they still had enough young men around to have amateur baseball teams. Now, amateur games were cut back a little during the war, and there were fewer teams, but most of the leading teams carried on during the war. If you remember Shelby Foote's masterful, dissertation on the Civil War for the Ken Burns series, he always uses the example of the Harvard rowing team as an example of the South, of the North having a surplus of strength and talent, and basically defeating the South with one hand. Remember, he says, these healthy young men on the rowing team were never called into the Army and never served because they weren't needed. Well, to me, a better comparison is not the Harvard rowing team, but just baseball, North and South. Basically, every Southern baseball team was destroyed by the war. But here you see in May of 1863, the Athletic Club of Philadelphia is playing a top club from New Jersey. And in fact, you'll see newspaper accounts of baseball teams in Philadelphia playing baseball all through the Gettysburg campaign, rather than joining the militia units being formed to, protect the Susquehanna River crossings or something like that. By the way, there was some criticism of the baseball players for not coming out en masse and, spending their time playing baseball rather than working in a war factory or volunteering for the Army. The war destroyed baseball teams, but paradoxically, it also helped to spread baseball throughout the country. Now, again, this is a statistical chart I've done of just the number of mentions of the word baseball in online newspaper databases from the years 1859 to 70. And you can see it's going up before the war. It dies down a lot during the war. But as soon as the war ends, it just explodes. What had happened was during the war, again, probably half the amateur teams in the North and all the ones in the South, well, all their guys were in the Army, so they had to disband. But what did also happen was people from areas where baseball wasn't being played, by the way, they were familiar with bat ball games like town ball already, but they weren't familiar with this New York game with, 9 players on a side and 9 innings, and they're playing whoever gets more in 9 innings wins rather than the first team that scores 21 or 100 wins. Well, these young men were exposed to baseball for the first time. And they said, boy, this is a lot better than the bat ball games we play at home. So after the war, after they got a discharge from the Army, they went back to Rockford, Illinois, or Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, I guess. and brought the idea of baseball and baseball teams with them and started baseball teams there. So the war, as I said, limits the growth of baseball, but also sets the stage for a nationwide explosion after the war. To the extent that by 1871, we can prove that baseball is played in every state of the nation, in all the territories that become states, including Alaska and Hawaii, and in several foreign countries as well. Professional baseball starts, well, there were amateur teams started to realize, yeah, it's fun and exercise, but it's a lot more fun if we win. So they started to say, hey, you know, let's offer a job to this guy who's a real good shortstop and make him an honorary member of our club. Let's pay his dues. He might be a poor Irish immigrant, can't pay the dues to the club. But man, if he can throw that baseball and hit the baseball hard, we want him a member of our club. So under the table, many of the wealthier amateur teams started to get ringers in. Those of you who are familiar with Ohio State football, by the way, know everything that Ohio State football program is accused of. Well, the amateur teams in those days, hiring essentially professionals, you know, phony people playing under assumed names for different teams and everything. Eventually, the Amateur Baseball Association gave up and said, okay, we'll sanction professional teams and let's just have amateur teams on one side of the table and professionals on the other. The first professional team, openly professional team, is the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869. They did a nationwide talent search. They had a payroll, by the way, of $12,000. Wow. For the entire team. And they won 81 games in a row, touring the country. And they showed that local amateur talent can't compete with nationwide professionals who do nothing more than practice and play baseball. Within 2 years, by 1861, the first professional baseball league is formed. In 1876, it reforms as the National League, which is the National League that we know of today. At least 40 Civil War veterans can be proven to have played Major League Baseball. And the number might be as high as 80. You know, it's just hard to do the research on some of these things. Remember, a soldier who was age 21 in 1865 would be only 26 in 1871 when the first professional league started, and only 32 in 1876 when the National League started. So a lot of the early professional players were understandably Civil War veterans. And in fact, two presidents of the National League and future Hall of Famers were Civil War veterans. Morgan Buckley, the first president of the National League. Albert Reach of Philadelphia. And not a Civil War veteran, but someone who was taught the game by a Civil War veteran, a guy named Al Spalding, who was not only the best pitcher of his time, he went on to manage and own the Chicago baseball franchise, and later started the Spalding Sporting Goods Company. So again, you can see just a million connections between baseball and the Civil War. If you want to know more about baseball during the Civil War era, here's two books that I can recommend. The older one, George Kirsch's Baseball in Blue and Gray. Yeah, a lot of research is supplanted what he wrote at the time. It's a very good introduction to it. And my friend Bill Reichik has written two books. This one is When Johnny Came Sliding Home. The Post-Civil War Baseball Boom, 1865 to 70. Another one of his volumes deals with baseball before 1865. Oh, oops, sorry. And I can also recommend the Proto Ball website that I contributed 8,000 different baseball games and baseball clubs prior to 1871. There's a listing of 12,000 of there. I was sort of asked by Major League Baseball through their Major League Baseball historian to try and find the first baseball in every town in the United States. And so if you're looking for your hometown, that's the place to look. And with that, I'd like to conclude by just saying thank you for having me. I hope you've learned something about the subject and everything. And I guess this is time for any questions or comments about beer, pizza, baseball, or anything else in particular. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much for all the details and telling those great vignettes about the game and how it impacted soldiers' lives. I'm going to check over, and we do have a question. This is from Scott Rosenau, who's one of the assistant program directors for the roundtable. Did any of the pre-war or early wartime Northern teams allow African American players?
That's a very good question. Were there integrated teams, racially integrated teams? No, there were not. I shouldn't say that. There was a Massachusetts team in 1869 that had one African American player on it that we found. What's more interesting is in 1867, I talked about the Association of Amateur Baseball Clubs, which was, oh, by the way, 95% Northern clubs at the time, and especially New York City-based Northern clubs. A strictly African-American club, the Pythians of Philadelphia, applied for membership, and these Northerners turned it down on the basis of their skin color. And there was great delight in Southern newspapers pointing out the utter hypocrisy of the Northerners saying, oh, you know, civil rights, free the slaves and abolition and all that, and not wanting to admit them to the baseball club fraternity. Interracial baseball, again, I've done some new discoveries on this. The first interracial baseball game was actually not black-white. It was in Hawaii between a team of Polynesians and a team of Caucasians in 1867. And a couple months after that, the first match game between an African-American club and a Caucasian club occurred in Cadiz, Ohio. You can talk about the color bar and everything, Jackie Robinson and that. Interesting enough, there were 3 or 4 African-American Major League Baseball players before 1890 when the Players Union instituted the color bar. And it was an unofficial one. The first African-American Major League Baseball player was a guy I found, actually, named William E. White. Not Jackie Robinson or anything like that. He played 1 game for Providence in 1879. And I don't think the team even knew he was African-American. He was 1/4 African-American, which made him African-American by law at the time. But one of the things about early baseball teams was they had very few players. And so if a guy got injured, they would look for a local amateur to fill in for a game. And they literally looked in the crowd, and there was this first baseman for the Brown University baseball team. So they waved up and said, hey, would you play first base for us for this game? And White did. And again, nobody knew that he was African-American because he didn't look any swarthier, if you will, than a lot of the other players. So, yeah, there was an early color bar, and it was a northern color bar, not a southern color bar.
That's a very interesting story, and I wouldn't have thought of of Hawaii having baseball or having it that early. That's
Hawaii and Alaska actually had baseball before several of the states of the continental United States. By the way, I should add that there were African American baseball teams playing other African American baseball teams in New York as early as 1858. And so it was well known that African, every race, creed, and color was playing baseball, but there just wasn't that kind of mixing.
all right. Are there other questions for Professor Allardice tonight? I'll go switch over and check on Facebook.
Yeah, about the Chicago team while you're checking. They were called the White Stockings at the time because these were unofficial nicknames. The newspapers know they wore White Sox in 1870, so they called them the Chicago White Stockings. Well, this actually is the future Chicago Cubs. They changed their nickname about 1900 when their star player Cap Anson left, and they just had a young team, and they were called Tiger Cubs or something like that. And they started to get the nickname Cubs. And then a new Chicago team was established, and they wanted to latch onto the old memories of the Chicago White Stockings, but they couldn't use the name White Stockings, so they nicknamed themselves the White Sox. Pittsburgh Pirates. Well, in 1897, the Pittsburgh team stole 4 players from the Louisville team. And the Louisville club called the Pittsburgh owners a bunch of pirates for pirating their players. And that's how the team became the Pittsburgh Pirates.
I don't see any additional questions at this point. But if anybody's out there, this is the opportunity for you to write in.
Let's see.
Oh, this is a dangerous question. Who is your team?
Who is my team? The Chicago White Sox. I grew up on the north side of Chicago, which is all Cub fans. But my dad was a Sox fan, and I think, it's a funny story. My dad, I think, wanted to irritate my mother, who was a big Cubs fan. All her family were Cub fans, and my dad's ambition in life was to drink all the beer in Chicago and to irritate my mother. And he was a Hall of Famer, by the way, at both. I mean, so I just went with him, I guess, even though I was a North Sider. I batted left-handed, even though I'm right-handed, I bat left-handed like he did and everything. My whole family, by the way, my sister and brother were huge Cub fans, by the way. So I guess I was an early rebel in that sense or something like that. It was tough being a Sox fan on the north side, I can tell you that. You go to a ball game, you get drunken Cub fans, they'd want to fight you. And that's basically one of the reasons I became a baseball historian was I found out the best way to avoid a fight with Cub fans is to show that you know more about the Cubs than they do and embarrass them verbally. And, Cubs, yeah. Well, of course, you're a big Cub fan. You know last time the Cubs won the pennant. Instead of punching you, they go, oh, and they forget to punch you. So, so that was good for both of us, I guess. I don't know. So in self-defense, almost, I had to become a baseball historian.
A lot of positive comments. One on Facebook. This is from Gregory. Thank you, and enjoyed this insight into an unknown aspect of the Civil War era.
I'm glad to help out. Maybe I can talk on a more battles and leaders related topic some other time. I don't know. I do a bunch of talks.
I did just think of something, and this is something I wondered about for a long time. I'm not sure you briefly, you did have a slide that mentioned cricket. Oh, it was one of the news clippings, but have you ever seen anything about why baseball took off here as opposed to cricket? Was it just, well, I won't hypothesize.
Well, actually, I've done a whole study on that subject.
Oh,
It just
okay.
shows I spent way too much time on arcane subjects. But in 1850, cricket got just as much play in the newspapers as baseball did, probably more. The problem with cricket was twofold. First of all, the Americans just said this is too slow a game. You play 2 days or something like that. Americans notoriously want faster decisions in their sports. We don't want ties either. I mean, we never had tie in baseball, basically. I mean, soccer, half the games ended in a tie, for crying out loud. So it was just a faster paced game and more suited to the American psyche. And the other reason was that cricket was looked upon as a foreign English game. That was an immigrant game. Now, cricket, I mean, there were in South Central Pennsylvania, there were a lot of cricket teams in the 1850s. And you see their mentions in newspapers all the time. But again, it was looked upon as foreign, and especially British foreign. And the British weren't too popular in 1860 among the Irish and just about everybody else in the United States, too. So in 1850, you wouldn't have known which game was going to be ending up on top, cricket or baseball. By 1858, clearly, baseball has supplanted cricket. And by 1870, cricket is 10% of baseball.
Wow. Okay. I would have supposed the British thing, but with the faster pace, that makes sense. Definitely makes sense as well.
You see that in newspaper accounts all the time, talking about, it's just not American. It just doesn't fit the American go-getter type thing.
Right. Well, it doesn't look like, oh, I'm sorry. We do have a question on Facebook. Who were those National League? Not sure if that's players. I'm not quite sure what the word is there, but who were the National League, I guess, players who were veterans of the war?
Well, I have a list. I can't tell you all.
That's 40. It's 40 people. So
yeah, probably the most famous is Allardice, who was a Philadelphia player, who later became Reach's Sporting Goods and Sporting Guides. He merged with Spalding to become Spalding Sporting Goods. He's a Hall of Famer for being a manager of the Philadelphia team. There are other, distinguished ones. I have a list. You send me an email and I'll send you the list. How about that? If anybody's that interested.
Sure. I reread the question, and I think the question was the presidents of the league.
Oh, Morgan Bulkley and A.G. Mills were the two presidents of the league who were Civil War veterans. But there were a bunch of owners, a guy named Mordecai Davidson, who owned the Louisiana team. He was a Civil War veteran. Louisville team, professional team, the Louisville Colonels. He was a Civil War veteran. Colonel Dan Jones. One of the interesting things, again, for a guy who's into the Civil War and genealogy like I am, in 1864, again with Early's invasion of Maryland, Pennsylvania formed a lot of 90-day volunteer regiments, the very high number regiments, 190 to 200th Pennsylvania, basically. A lot of them were Philadelphia. And in one regiment, basically all the baseball players in Philadelphia joined one or two companies of, I think it was 196th Pennsylvania. So one of the great ways of tracing a Civil War ball player is just to take a look at the roster of the 196th Pennsylvania and compare that to known baseball players who are mentioned in the newspapers. Unfortunately, a lot of the newspapers, again, there was amateur teams, all they do is list their last name. And that's why we have 40 possibles. They usually didn't do a first name, and there's probably 10 John Smiths in Philadelphia, sort of hard to tell which one's the veteran, which one's the baseball player.
Right. That makes it tough. I've run into that too, doing newspaper research. All right. Basic question here. When were gloves introduced? Catcher's mitts.
Catcher's mitt, boy. The kind of glove that you would wear outside in the cold or that was being done off and on before 1870. The hard ball, in fact, when the batter would hit it, before gloves, the fielders wouldn't really try and catch it very well if it was really hard hit because it would break their fingers. And they start to get gloves, especially the catcher's gloves, about 1880. The catcher's mask and mitt, I think, first mask was patented about 1885. And by 1890, they're wearing primitive gloves. The gloves that we know of today that have that big pocket and trap, now these are gloves that are literally just a padded, glove that you'd wear in winter. The kind of one that you can trap the baseball in the webbing and so it doesn't really hurt your hands. That is not really introduced until the 1920s, the so-called Bill Doak, Spit and Bill Doak glove. Bill Doak was a famous pitcher for the St. Louis team, and he was the one who pioneered that sort of trap mitt that becomes so popular today.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. I was wondering about this one too. The question from Facebook, from Gregory. For a brief second during the presentation, there was a slide with Robert E. Lee with a ball cap. Can you explain?
Oh boy, I really ought to show the slide here. So let's see if maybe I can do that. So hold on a second. Sorry, it's something I didn't want to include in this presentation because it just take too long. But because I have several different variations of the slideshow from current slide. You can still see me. Okay, can you see the? I may better get the slide share back there. There we go. After the war, General Beauregard was made the honorary president of a New Orleans baseball team, and none other than General Robert E. Lee was made the honorary president of the Richmond Baseball Club.
Wow.
And of course, yeah, there's him with the Cubs hats on. You can see that. And there's him with his Cubs uniform. Luckily, the Cubs had a first baseman named Derek Lee, and I was able to find a photo of his uniform there. But yeah, a lot of Confederate Army generals and veterans were associated with baseball. The one-time commander of Lee's Texas Brigade, Van Manning, he was the president of a baseball team in Corinth, Mississippi after the war. I mean, you can't get more diehard Confederate than the Texas Brigade. One of Ranger Mosby's top lieutenants, Alexander Babcock, he was a New Yorker who went south to fight for the Confederacy. He was a pre-war baseball player, and he started the Richmond Baseball Club. I mean, you can't get any more diehard Confederates than, Texas Brigade, Mosby's Rangers, and Robert E. Lee. So it's part and parcel of the post-war South as well as the post-war North.
All right. We have a question in the Q&A, which I just lost. There it is. Just a question about your website, Protoball. If you could explain that.
Yeah, the website is actually sponsored by a friend of mine and by the Society of American Baseball Research. But 2/3 of the entries are mine. Again, about 7 years ago, I got, somebody asked me to enter all the Civil War baseball games. I just kept on going on that. So every time I have an hour in between classes or something, I try and look up a new baseball team or two. But the website is vast. Pre-pro means pre-1871 baseball. We have a glossary of defining 300 different bat ball games before and after baseball, including the Cantigas de Santa Maria game, cricket, softball, modern variations. We have a database with 9,000 newspaper clippings. As I said, we have 9,000 clubs and 3,000 games. And again, one of my projects is to get countries. I've found baseball in 170 different countries on Earth in some fashion or another, and they're all entered there. We have statistical studies, analytical studies, articles. I edit the newsletter and I put that on. There's, basically anything about baseball before 1871, that should be the go-to source. And my article on Civil War baseball playing is there too, and it goes into a lot more detail than I could go into, obviously, in this presentation. It's open to everybody too. www.protoball.org.
And I put that into the chat on Zoom, and I also put it into the comments on Facebook in case you needed to see that again. All right. I don't see any additional comments or questions at this time, so I think now might be a good time for us to wrap up for the evening. Oh, very good.
I skip beer in baseball too. Yeah. So,
that sounds very interesting. Maybe another time we could do that.
Well, interesting enough, in 1860, the beer companies in St. Louis were Catholics in St. Louis were forbidden by the archdiocese to go to saloons on Sunday. Right. So what they did was they go to baseball games, and the Catholic Church hierarchy hadn't caught up with baseball yet, so they drank the beer at baseball games instead.
Well, it was certainly a way of not working on a Sunday. So I'm not sure if that was exactly the intent, but all right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Allardice. We really appreciate you coming and speaking before us virtually. One of the great things about these is that we've been able to bring in speakers from quite a distance, certainly quite a distance in your case, which would not have been possible in a more traditional format. So I think it's something we definitely would like to continue in the roundtable from time to time. All right. Well, thank you all very much. As I said, our next roundtable event will be on June 16th. That's the third Wednesday night in June. And we will be doing it in person at the History Center Museum. And we will also be streaming it on Zoom and Facebook Live, I believe. So please keep that in mind. And we hope you have a great few weeks and enjoy this great weather. Thanks again for attending. And thank you very much, Bruce, for coming in and visiting us tonight.
My pleasure.
All right. Take care.